Scott Pendlebury from the Collingwood Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
This is Patrick Crouch from the Carlton Footy Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Max Gawn, Melbourne Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Number 36 in the 50 most relevant players for SuperCoach, AFL Fantasy and Dream Team, at least according to me, for 2025. We are talking about St Kilda Saint Nasiah Wanganeen-Milera. He's done what many thought was impossible, that pretty much from his second year, he's been in the territories of a premium defender for us. Another good year last year, but can he elevate himself up to the top echelons and become one of the best premium defenders for us in 2025. We're going to talk about that, the Saints, and a whole lot more on this episode of the 50 Most Relevant. Joining us on the podcast, you met him last year during the 50 Most Relevant, but it's first time on with us in 2025. You know him from the social media platform as X, as the Fantasy Nut, the man that hides behind, and rightfully so, that beautiful caricature that you can see on screen if you're watching this on YouTube. It's the Fantasy Nut. Hello, mate. How are you? Nice to see you. Nasiah is an interesting guy to talk about, isn't he?
Hey, mate. I appreciate the invite again. The 50 Most Relevant's back, which means pre-season's underway. I can't wait to get stuck into it. And, yeah, super excited to talk about this guy because I think he's perhaps flying under the radar a little bit in terms of the discussion of those top-end defenders that we're considering, and it's taken a little bit of a back seat, perhaps unfairly, which we might get into to his colleague Jack Sinclair.
Yeah, defensive eligible, basically a flatline 101 average in SuperCoach, meaning in that format, $543,700 is what you're going to be paying for him, while in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team, not quite a triple-figure average. You got close, though, one kick away, a seasonal average of 97.7. A flat mill is what you're looking at in AFL Fantasy, and $990,200 in Dream Team. Well, his top scores last year, well, a career high score in SuperCoach. That match up against Essendon all the way back at the end of July, a 134, while it's a 127 last year in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team against the Tigers. He did do a little bit better in 2023, just a 3-point jump to a career high best in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team, a 130 against the Demons. That's coming off a season where he played 22 games. Mate, we should talk about this type of player. Again, such a beautiful user of the ball. It was someone that St Kilda were thrilled to draft now back almost a handful of years ago. So reliable by foot, so penetrating, so creative. Lots of meters gained with how he gets rid of the ball. Super effective with his disposal. It's why he almost found his home across halfback almost by accident when many thought he'd be a wingman at the AFL level. The way he sets up the play for the Saints is just beautiful. The way they get the ball in his hands is so high value that it should be of no surprise to us that not only does he appear in the 50 most relevant, but he gets so much quality ball use through his hands and through his feet.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, as you said, he's a beautiful player to watch, and as you alluded to, it's absolutely no surprise that the St Kilda would want to have the ball in his hands as often as they possibly can. And I think his improvement, it's not that often that you see these absolute, gun youngsters, but really improve in each of their first 2-3 seasons, just as he has. I mean, he came into the league in that first year where he averaged 51, big leap into that second year, averaging 91, and then last year took another step up, averaging just a tick under 98. So the trend is going in the right direction. And I guess in a year like this year where, structure-wise, we are kind of all looking at one or two premium defenders and deciding which ones to start. And I think most would agree that those 4 or 5 110 defenders that we all had last year, they've all got question marks, and we know the name of the game is to try and get more than what you pay for. So not many people are super excited about those 110 defenders. So we're really sort of looking at that bracket in that 90 to 100 point per game range amongst these defenders, about which of those ones can do what a Sheasel and a Whitfield did last year? They both went into last year averaging about, or being priced at about 95, and both took a big step up. So who is going to be those one or two guys this year that might be able to do that? And as I said to you at the start, I mean, I feel like Miller is perhaps going a little bit under the radar as someone that, under the right circumstances, of course, has both the ability and opportunity to perhaps do that. So, as I said, really relevant player to have a look at this year.
He's sitting third in the league per game for kicks, 6th for metres gained, 11th for bounces, 17th for rebound 50s, and a top 20 guy for effective disposals across the league. So without even drilling into some of these fantasy and SuperCoach numbers, here is a guy that used the ball foot predominant, which is ultimately where the highest scoring components come from, gets lots of meterage with his disposals, runs and carries and brings the balls into dangerous spaces, is the primary mover of the ball, rebounding out of 50 for his team, and then making sure when he does have the ball, he uses it really well. It's why in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team last year, that 97.7 consisted of 9 tons, just 2 of them over 120, but super important as much as the ceiling is the fact that a player won't burn you with a bad basement score. He just had the 2 scores all year last year under 80. It was the same in SuperCoach, just the 2 scores under 80 last year. The 2 120-plus scores, but 12 tons in that seasonal average of 109, really 100.9, not 109, really building off that trend that we saw of end of 2023, where he's basically a mid to high 90s averaging guy across the back half of 2023. And you're talking about these sort of players that have a pathway to 10 points per game at the top end, because generally we are looking for 20, 30, 25 points per game of value with upside, which generally doesn't happen in and around this 90s and 100 marker. But all he needs is another 5 to 10 points per game with a very easy pathway to how it could happen. And now you're getting value right at the top end. And FantasyNut, if we get that, this is a knockout pick.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, if perhaps those the Zorkos and the Sheasel with a positional change and Nick Martin with a positional change, perhaps Whitfield regressed a little bit, Flanders maybe moving back into that midfield. So we may actually not see that many, if any, defenders average close to that 110 mark this year. And if that's the case, someone like Miller has the opportunity of being D1. I mean, that would not shock me at all. It's if he could somehow get to close to that 105 mark. It's interesting that you point out that very, very high floor, because intuitively, when you see someone that is that damaging off half back, you always have that fear in the back of your mind that this is a player that opposition coaches are going to target with a tag. We haven't really seen that come to fruition. And so, as you said, there's only 2 games below about 84, I think it is. So extremely high floor. So he's very unlikely to burn you. It would be nice, and I think, I suspect, to get to that well over 100 average, he probably does need a few of those more ceiling scores. But as you've just asked, like, what is the pathway to potentially seeing that happen? And I think there's probably a couple of scenarios. And I think the first one we're going to talk about is obviously Riley Bonner no longer being in the team. Bonner was, he had a lot of usage for St Kilda, both in terms of kick-ins, but also in terms of how he scored in transition coming out of defensive 50 as well. So if you look at 2024, basically the top 3 kick-in guys were Milera, Sinclair and Bonner. Milera had about 91 kick-in, Sinclair 65, and Bonner 50 overall. But in games where all 3 of them were playing, Bonner had about 30% of kick-ins. So that's a fair chunk. You look at the real top-end defender scorers last year, Zorkos, Ryans, Whitfields, etc., Sheasel, their kick-in numbers were huge. Like, they were taking bulk kick-ins. And I tweeted the other day, actually, like, there's probably no better tailwind for fantasy scoring than getting these free +3s, 4, 5, 6, sometimes, more times a game. And it's not just the +3. They they often kick it to someone in the back pocket and then get it back. Like, it's often +6, +9 even. It's extraordinary how those scores can then add up really quickly. So last year, Milera already had 91. That's not top of the range in the AFL, but it's already getting up there, like, reasonably so. I mean, you look at some of the higher kick-in guys last year. Ryan, believe it or not, had 150 of them or thereabouts. Whitfield had 150 as well. So these are sort of the absolute top of the range. The other very high kick-in guys were about that 110 mark. So Zorko was about 110. Sheasel was on track for about 110 kick-ins when he was playing in that back part in defence. Flanders too, on track for about that 110 mark when he was in defence. So, could Milera go from that 90-ish kick-in mark to, potentially absorbing a fair chunk of Bonner's kick-ins and get to above that 110 mark? I think that's one avenue where we could see him get a nice little scoring bump there. You ask the question, obviously, is Ross the boss going to really trust someone like a young Schoenmaker or, Travalia, this kid that's come in? Are they really going to be taking bulk kick-ins? I struggle to see that happening. The other guy, obviously, that can take a lot of them is going to be Jack Sinclair. And I guess if you go back to 2023 and look at what St Kilda did there, they basically split the kick-ins in two. So the top three kick-in guys for St Kilda in 2023 was, once again, Milera. He had 104 of them. Sinclair had 90. Then the third best guy was Stocker with 24. So my gut tells me that they'll probably go to that sort of split again, and it will be almost a 50-50 between Milera and Sinclair. But if there's a scenario, or if it turns out to be that actually they're going to give Milera almost exclusive kick-in duties, and he gets up to that 130, 140, 150 kick-ins, that's absolutely one pathway that we might see him bump up his average.
Yeah, for sure. And let alone if in SuperCoach, where there is not a huge gap between his fantasy and his SuperCoach averages, if he starts to get involved with more score involvements, if St Kilda, who are notoriously on the lower end of scoring through transition and scoring from kick-ins, if they can elevate that part of their game, let alone any of the elements you've mentioned around the kick-ins, well, now all of a sudden there's a rising tide of ways that Nasiah can start to take that scoring from a low to mid-high 90s range in AF into the low hundreds, mid 105 range, or in SuperCoach now up into that 110 territory where it becomes an undeniable pick. I want to come back to Bonner for you in a second. There's some Sinclair questions and then just some defensive structure stuff I want to ask you before we wrap up the episode. Is market shares are a relatively newly introduced understanding in the community. The centre bounce attendance tracking was pioneered by the draft doctors about 5 seasons ago, and now it's just common language lexicon for us, as we understand that centre bounce presence impacts positional allocation and more often than not, but not always, an increase in scoring consistency and ceiling. Market shares really only been in our language for the better part of 12 months. And I'm seeing across the community, I'm keen on your take as an astute component of the game and a studier of the game. I'm seeing people go, well, Bonner had 5% market share in AFL Fantasy of the ball use for the Saints. Therefore, that 5% will be redistributed wealth across Sinclair, Travalia, Milera, McRae, whoever you like it. Is that a too simplistic way to look at an understanding of market share, or is that a right way to look at things?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think firstly, just obviously credit Rowan, who you and I both chat to a little bit as well. That with I think introducing that sort of concept into AFL fantasy, I think he's got a very keen background in NFL fantasy, and so I kind of view market share as I like to use the term usage. And so I think, coming back to your question with regards to Bonner, I think the answer is no with regards to, he averaged, 80 points a game, something in like, therefore that's 80 points that must go to someone else. I can tell you as someone that unfortunately didn't own Bonner last year, and it was infuriating watching him. there's a lot of ball that he got that someone else, I'm talking about these little 15-meter sideways leads just to get to a cheap mark. There's no rule that says that the next player coming in is going to get that or play the same way and therefore create the same number of points. So I don't think you can automatically, again, just presume that the points that Bonner accrued from playing is automatically going to go to someone else. I do think, and this is why I'm probably focusing a little bit more on kick-ins, all things being equal, i.e. the number of kick-in opportunities, those kick-ins will have to go to someone else, that's for sure. But once again, just using that example, is that 15-meter diagonal run just to get on the end of a cheap, relatively useless mark, does that have to be repeated with the next guy coming in? Not necessarily. And so certainly some of those points will be redistributed. I don't think you can just simply redistribute them to Milera and Sinclair because they're the two big dogs. I don't think that's going to be how it works. I think some of those points will go to Sean Maker if he's one of those other distributors back there, or guy gets a bit of ball. The kid that's coming in, he'll get a little bit of the ball, and some of the points that Bonner got just from the way he plays won't return, and that's that. So again, I'd probably focus a little bit more on the stuff that we know has to happen, which is once again, kick-ins is one of those things. But I think you're probably right. I think just presuming that 5% or whatever it was that Bonner got, I don't think we can just assign those points to 1, 2, 3, 4 other people and say the team points total must stay the same. What if St Kilda changed the way they play, for instance? That could absolutely happen, and that completely distorts everything. So again, I wouldn't just simply chop those points up amongst a few players and call it a day.
Well, you mentioned if they change any of their game style, well, scoring-wise, this is drastically different. They're 4th in the league last year as a team for total disposals, 2nd for marks, and top 5 for uncontested possession. So we know that's how Ross Lyon coach teams always move the ball, which is high work rate, get into space, control the ball with a mark kick style of game. That's been evident in his first stint at St Kilda, Fremantle, and now coming back to St Kilda. So if there's any evolution in that whatsoever, like they're top 4 for AFL Fantasy points as a team, 12th for SuperCoach. Like if some of that moves a degree backwards, well, now this is the change that we should be interested in. I'm curious on your take around our structure and value. And it might not feel like he's the right person to do it, but I actually think he is. There feels like there's 2 lines this year where we're really happy with the value of options. And then there's 2 we're not as certain about. The 2 that I think as a community and across formats, we're like, yep, there's plenty of value options, is the forward line and the midfield. I think the midfield will see some diversification, but the forward line feels very stock, standard, similar. We're all going to be the same with maybe 1 or 2 degrees of differences. Do you start Horne-Francis or not? It's probably the difference, really. But the rucks and the defensive line, it does feel like, well, I'm not stoked with the value, so I'll go to the top end. But if value determines our structure, and that's obviously a big premise, if value determines our structure, what does that mean for a player like Nasiah, who you could argue has a little bit of upside, but also we might be paying top dollar for, but we've got so much excess cash that we feel like we should just go get him. How do you see this impacting our defensive structures, especially at the upper end of our defensive premiums?
The last thing you want to hear when you need your auto insurance most is a robot with countless irrelevant menu options. Which is why with USAA Auto Insurance, you'll get great service that is easy and reliable, all at the touch of a button. Get a quote today. Restrictions apply. USAA.
And your point is even more relevant if you do believe there is also some value in the rucks. Like you've got maybe a Tom Conning there. You've previously already spoken about Flynn. Darcy's there as well. So you add that into the mix as well, and potentially a bumper crop of rookies, almost in every line by the rucks. The point is that we seemingly have a lot of cash to spend that has to go somewhere, right? Yeah. And so I think what we're kind of left with is the situation where again, you make a team full of what you deem to be value picks, and you've got $600,000-$700,000 left over. And so where does that go? Then you start going, okay, well, where can I spend that? And if you're, again, the forward line has almost picked itself this year, and the midfield as well. There's value options at almost every price point in the midfield as well. So we're kind of left with this situation where we're kind of almost forced to pick one or two premium defenders. There doesn't seem to be a bunch of very obvious mid-pricer options in defence. Once again, we've got a couple of potential good rookies in defence in Sard and potentially Travaglia as well, and maybe a couple others. We've got a Callum Mills there. And so, Jaden Short's already 30% owned. So that's potentially 4 spots taken up by those types of guys. And then we're like, okay, well, we've got, 1.9 million or something like that, 2 million to go. Okay, well, which 2 top-end defenders do we want? And I think if we had a prime Doherty, doing a 110 where we weren't concerned with his role and we're like, you know what, I think I'm going to probably get something around 110 again, we'd probably lock them in much the same way that a lot of people are deciding to do with the rucks this year, right? And so people are looking at going, you know what, I think Marshall's done around that 115, 116, 117 mark for 2 years in a row. I feel relatively confident he's going to do that again. So maybe that's where I'll park my excess cash, or a Tristan Cherry, but in the same vein as well. So, but in defence, we don't really have those options at the very, very top end, i.e. those 110 guys that we have high confidence in repeating their numbers. I mentioned a few of them earlier, the Zorkos, Shees, Flanders. For various different reasons, we've got concerns about whether they're going to repeat those numbers. I don't think picking a guy or priced at around that 110 mark who might end up going 100, that's probably not a great play. And so I think if we felt confident in those guys repeating, then maybe we would be comfortable, happy to park our cash there. But those top end guys, I think most of us would agree, are probably going to regress for one reason or another, reasonably significantly. So that's why we're looking at that next bracket down. So those guys priced in that 90 to 100 mark that are either going to be relatively safe options. And I think someone like Tom Stewart has typically been picked in seasons past because we've felt relatively confident of him roughly repeating what he's always done. He's actually, I don't know if he's ever been in the top 6 defenders, or certainly not very commonly. But he's kind of often just given us what we've paid for. And so he often is like that safe fallback premium option that we've just plucked and go, you know what, I like a couple of his early games, maybe he can get me off to a flyer, but I feel like I know what I'm going to get. Milera might be someone like that, even though I think he's got a bit more upside. Like, we've mentioned his high floor. We've also, what's the scenario barring injury that we can see him falling a lot from here? One might be a change in game style, sure, but as you've already said, Ross the Boss has played the same kind of way, 2-3 different teams now. Like, it's almost, it's less likely that he's all of a sudden going to change, though possible. So that's one possible way, obviously injury being another. Another possible scenario we might see Milera fall a lot would be if he had multiple games where he was tagged. Again, yet to see that. So I'd probably put that as less likely as well, though possible. So once again, we've got a scenario where you'll be paying someone around that 98 mark. You're probably going to get something like that. But on top of that, there is a path, as we've talked about, where he might actually go to another level. And we've referred to the kick-ins as one big variable in which we might see him go to 105. I think the other big variable potentially is what's going to happen with Jack Sinclair. And so, last year, we saw Sinclair, play a little bit of midfield. You look at towards the end of that season last year, and they were running guys like Paddy Dow, Clark, Zach Jones, Liam Stocker in the midfield. I mean, of course they had to put Sinclair there, but in those games though where Sinclair was, I mean, I looked at this yesterday actually. You look at games where Sinclair got at least 30% CBAs, and Milera averaged 103, and that's versus an average of 93 when Sinclair didn't get those CBA numbers. So I wonder, once again, is if Sinclair is in more of a midfield role, I wonder if Milera potentially gets a little bit more of that market share or usage coming out of the back half, because it's now going to be all him, basically, right? And I asked Jaden Popowski to come up with some numbers to kind of, that's a pretty crude sort of statistic I've just come up with, but he kind of confirmed that, look, Milera, when Sinclair was playing in defence, Miller's transition points were marginally less than when Sinclair was playing in the midfield. So, and only, once again, we're not expecting an average of, or we're not really, hoping for a bump of 20, 30 points per game here. 5 points, 6 points, and all of a sudden you've got an absolute knockout pick at that absolute top end probably. So that might be something else just to keep in mind with regards to how could Miller's scoring or upside be affected. It might be what happens with Sinclair.
Yeah,
they've obviously brought in Jack Macrae. Phillip, who's obviously going to hopefully have a step up this year as well. So you might be looking at a midfield rotation for St Kilda of Jack Steele, Macrae, Phillipou, Windhager, maybe Hunter Clark's in there. And I look at that midfield and I think none of them, they probably, Sinclair does add a lot there. You know what I mean? Like that silk, that good usage. And so I still am inclined to believe that Sinclair will still spend a little bit of time in midfield. I don't know to what extent. And that might be the thing that, once again, determines to what level, if any, Milera has in terms of upside.
Yeah, I'm with you. I can see a world where Sinclair, who spent some time not only across half back and taking that kick-in role, not only as a centre bounce mid, but also across the wing. I can see a world where he plays less off that wing with a little bit more time and development into the likes of a Darcy Wilson. A Toby Travalia can come in and sit in that spot. They've already got a Brad Hill amongst others that can sit in that outside speed and class space. I can see a world where exactly what you've mapped out for us actually occurs. And we see not only a potential impact on some of that scoring element for Sinclair and others in centre bounce, but also a potential upside avenue without much changing in ball usage or ball rate or market share, but just by the change in the team of a player, it can have this cascading impact, let alone then if you throw in the fact of, you're talking about value at the top end of our defenders. Well, he's got no early buys for us. So where people are looking at Sicily and Stewart with some upside, or Holmes or Whitfield, Houston, Zorko, Martin, just to name a few of these guys that are all top-ish of the line, if not top of the line. He's a guy that's got potential pathway to upside, no early season buy, a potential avenue of even improving on his scoring basement. Like, these all become upside elements. The only thing I'd probably be interested in your take is, I know they've got a favourable mid-season buy, but Fremantle and St Kilda, there's a fair chance that if you're hunting for value, these are two of the teams you're looking for in a couple of spots, let alone if you like one or two of their top dogs.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I think, as you said, in that round 13 bye, it's just St Kilda and Fremantle. So, intuitively, we'll always, those guys will be tempting. But we've just got to be a little bit careful, because Jack Macrae is going to be in every team. Phillipou is probably going to be in every team. It seems like someone like an Andy Brayshaw is becoming quite a popular, midfielder around that 105 mark that might return to 110 plus. If you're also interested in maybe a Sean Darcy being a value ruck option, and then on top of that, you go someone like a Milera or obviously a Jack Sinclair.
Yeah.
You've then got a fair few guys on that buy, most of which perhaps instead of not Sean Darcy, but the rest of them are guys you'd probably want to keep as as season-long guys. You don't have to, of course, but these are not mid prices that you're going to necessarily be looking to offload at their buy. So just being a little bit mindful of how many of those that you do end up going for. But I mean, look, you made a good point before with regards to how much ball Miller is already getting. So this is probably not going to be all about just like natural development, right? And so I don't think we can just go, this is a gun player. I think he's just going to get better. I mean, look, that may happen, but as you said, he's already near the top of the AFL in several of those possession-related statistics. And so I think there's got to be some other factor that changes that sees us get that extra 5-6 points of upside. And I think both of those scenarios that were outlined, one being the kick-ins and or two, what happens with Jack Sinclair, both of those absolutely could happen. And I think if they both happened, that's the scenario that you might see Miller go to that 105, 107 points per game sort of mark. And look, it really wouldn't shock us if it happened. This is not this guy's an absolute star. If someone like Lachie Whitfield can, I don't see why Miller can't do it. It's just nailing the sort of the scenario in which it happened. And I don't think he's just going to go from 25 possessions to 34 possessions. That's not going to happen. It's got to be some other tweak in terms of what actually occurs to see that bump, I think.
Yeah, selecting someone like a Nasiah in your starting squad, you're wanting to get someone at the top end of the tree that you feel pretty confident there's no downside risk. You feel like at worst, I'm going to get within a point or two of what I'm paying for with those one or two of those pathways that have been mapped out throughout this podcast of picking up a share of kick-ins or picking up some of the ball movement that would have come from Sinclair if he phases into more of a centre bounce role. If one or two of those pop, well, there's my 10 points per game of upside, and now I'm at the top line of defensive premiums. So if you're in that landscape of going, I don't want to pay at the very top, but I don't want to bottom out, this is where the appeal of Nasiah sits, with a pathway or two to becoming top of the line. We'll talk about draft in a second, but it's a fascinating ideology, isn't it, to choose to start Nasiah. He feels like he's always going to be priced attainably for us, but it could be an interesting and a unique starting option.
Well, it certainly is. And I think that's an important point because he currently has, I don't know what value looking at percentage ownership has at this point in the season, but perhaps we can compare it to his teammate in Jack Sinclair. They're both priced kind of similarly, play for the same team. He has 4% ownership, and I think Sinclair has about 20% ownership. And
in AF,
some of I wonder if that's reflective of the value that each has. You could maybe, I don't know if Sinclair's going to feature on your list at some point or not, but maybe the path for Sinclair is something along the lines of those kick-ins going to him that Bonner had. But I would make an even money bet with regards to who's got the best chance of increasing their average by 5 points per game at this point. And I'd probably lean more towards Milera. And so it's interesting that one guy has, 5 times as much ownership as the other. And I suspect it just comes down to the fact that Sinclair has kind of done it, right? I think, 3 years in a row he's done smack bang on 102.
Yeah.
Whereas we don't have that sort of nadir, so to speak, for Miller as to where's he going to settle in at? Was that 98 and out of the box sort of season? Will he go back to 91? Maybe just a little bit of that uncertainty of what to expect from him. Though I would argue that, given that those floor numbers that we talked about, you could argue at his price point, he's one of the most safest options in terms of the premium defenders.
It's not something we feel confident in saying in 2025. Safety at the top-end premium defenders, but maybe that's the way we should be looking at what Nasiah Wanganeen-Milera could become for us in 2025 in our classic formats of the game. But on the keeper platform is where we're drafting at the coaches panel in 2025. And on draft day, if you're drafting based off average, well, he's probably a D1 in your keeper or AFL Fantasy style platforms. While if you're drafting over on SuperCoach with some kind of other customizations that keeper does let you have, it's probably sitting more in that D2 range. I feel like But that's probably about the right sort of spot for him. You don't have to reach for him. He's not that overly attractive name like the Sheasel types or the Whitfields. He doesn't have anything that makes you go, oh, yeah, I have to get my hands on him. But he's just consistent. He's reliable. A lack of ceiling might hurt him, but it's protected by that high-scoring floor. I just think he's a nice defensive piece to build your draft team around. D1 in AFL Fantasy, D2 in SuperCoach feels about right to me. What about you?
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think one thing that I really like in drafts, like in terms of player attributes, is that high floor. Yeah. Yes, he's less likely to pop a 150 than, say, a Luke Ryan or something like that. But once again, if you're talking about 16, 17 games out of 21 where he's gone, 90 plus, you know what you're going to get each weekend. Often particularly in a tight league, you got a tight matchup. One of your good players gets tagged or whatever and spits out a 55. That's enough to lose you the matchup. So I would always place just that little bit of premium on those premium types that have a high floor.
Yep, I'm with you. A high floor to me is as valuable as a high ceiling on draft day, because for every high floor game, it's protected by that lack of basement that others might have sitting in there. So I really like that. Hey, mate, where can we keep in touch with you across social media? I'm sure you'll pop up in and around the landscape of AFL Fantasy and SuperCoach community and podcasts and social media. But where can we get in touch with you and follow some of your thoughts during this 2025 preseason? Yeah,
good on you, mate. As you know, I typically hang out on Twitter or X, and you can find me at FantasyNut_AFL. Just post some thoughts here and there. So come along and get involved.
If you missed where that is, the good news is we put that in the description of the episode. This will not be the last time we speak to the Fantasy Nut this pre-season. Whether it's in the 50 most relevant or in something else, well, you'll just have to hang on the channel and find out and see. If you want to go back and check out any of the other players we revealed over the past couple of weeks in the 50 most relevant, whether it be an audio platform podcast or over on YouTube, you can go and check us out. If you are watching this on YouTube, make sure you like the video and comment below. What do you think Nasiah is going to average in 2025? Keen to get your thoughts. And if you're an audio podcast listener and you haven't given the Coaches Panel a 5-star review, we'd love for you to do it. It takes you 2 seconds, but it does make a huge impact for us here at the Coaches Panel. We've also got in the description of this episode not only the places where you can get in touch on X to the Fantasy Nut, where you can get in touch with us across social media, links to the Coaches Panel merch store, our Patreon, and everything else you need to know. Because our Patreons at that breakout and premium tier, they're a day ahead of you on the audio podcast. That is just one of a number of rewards they get. So as well as supporting the Coaches Panel, there is a bunch of content you can get. So if you're not a Patreon, we'd love for you to join in on that. Okay, let's give you a clue to see if you can figure out who's next at number 35. We've talked about value and that word a lot this preseason. Maybe as a fantasy community, we've become obsessed with the word value a little too much. And this guy that's in at 35 has shown us that he has oodles of upside, oodles of value. And when the chips fall his way, he's an out-and-out top liner in his line. But there's a problem. There's one annoying, nagging headache that I just don't know if we could rule out is going to go away. Because if that one little nagging, annoying headache goes away, he becomes undisputed and a must select. Yes, I used the dangerous term on Coaches Panel. I used the word must. But that headache won't go away. And it could be the difference between him being a boom, a bust, or an up and down, frustrating round-to-round selection. Who is he? And what's that headache? We'll talk about that tomorrow in the 50 Most Relevant.